So thank you, everyone. Welcome to Everything You Need to Know About Data Broadband. It's presented today by the National Broadband Resource Hub, Schools, Health, and Libraries Broadband Coalition, Alaska Public Interest Research Group, and MLab. I am Stacy Baxter, Program Manager at Next Century Cities, and I will be today's MC and panel moderator. I am joined by Alex Kelly, Director of Broadband Consulting with Center on Rural Innovation, along with Kirsten Lardy, Broadband Consultant from Center on Rural Innovation, and Corianne Zacher, Senior Policy Counsel with Next Century Cities. In today's webinar, we'll be examining the latest on broadband mapping challenges process, best practices and tips on collecting broadband survey data, and hot button data topics and questions submitted by you, the audience. So starting us off on our agenda, we're going to be discussing what types of data are useful. Then we'll move into where to find broadband data. And then we will end with a panel discussion and some questions. A quick note about questions. If you have questions during the webinar, feel free to use the chat function or the Q&A function through Zoom. However, like I said, we'll be saving some time towards the end of the webinar to answer questions that you may have if you prefer to save them for later. Without any further ado, I think Kirsten is going to get.
Thank you, Stacy. Okay, so primarily we're going to be working with three main buckets of data that are useful when we're talking about the broadband planning process. Data on physical location, existing network infrastructure, and data about community needs. So in the first category of things, we're looking at stuff like where are all the homes, where are all the businesses, and where are all the community anchor institutions. You're going to want to get as granular as possible with this type of data. So these can be address points on a map, latitude, longitude coordinates, sometimes even power meters. So those are the types of things you're looking at for physical locations. You're also going to want to know whether those addresses are served, unserved, or underserved. And just a note when you're looking at these data sets, some of them won't actually need service. So we're talking here about like cemeteries, trailheads, and we find that up to like 10% of your data set includes buildings that don't need service. So that's just something to be aware of when you're looking at these types of physical location data. Once you find out which locations need service and where they are, you're also going to want to look at fiber drop distances. So drop distances would be the distance between the building and the road, or the building and the existing utility pole. The reason you need this is because the further away from the road or the pole, the more expensive the drop is going to be. So when you're looking at physical data, those are the types of things you want to look for. In terms of existing network infrastructure, this is about who is the provider, what tech they're offering, and where are they. So location of utility poles, if you have towers that could be used for radios, where are they? Locations of hubs, which is particularly necessary when you're looking at DSL. And where is fiber buried? Where is it aerial? Those types of things. There's a lot of things you want to be looking for when you're talking about existing infrastructure. And then when you look at that infrastructure, who owns it and what service are they providing? So that's a good basis for existing network. And then lastly, if you're going to be putting together a broadband plan, then you're going to need to know what the community needs. If you want to provide the best service to the community, then you're going to need to understand what the current lived experience is in that community. So we're talking here barriers to access. Customers' interest in a new service provider, what's their relationship with the current ISPs that live there or that are there, stuff like customer service, affordability, speeds, and reliability. This is really important to get as granular as possible as well, because that's figuring out what your needs here will really show you where your gaps are in your broadband planning process. Next slide, Alex. If anyone wants to add anything on this slide, go ahead. Okay, so where are you going to be using this data? This is just a couple examples. This is definitely not an exhaustive list of where you might need it, but we can just run through these. Market analysis. So you need to know where the existing ISP footprint is and what they're charging. That's going to inform your business model penetration rates, and it's going to tell you how you're going to be competitive. So what are your competitive services that you're providing, and how does that compare to the current market? Network design phase, you're going to need physical addresses and existing infrastructure data. That's going to show you how much everything is going to cost, right? So what are those drops, all that stuff. And then what is the demand like in the community for broadband, and how do you apply that? So a really good way to apply that, just a quick example, let's say like 50% of your unserved customers are supporting the plan you created, and say like they will sign up or have already signed up for broadband. That's a really good way to leverage funding for your network and show and highlight that the broadband plan that you've created is really backed up by community support. So for financial modeling, again, likely customers and their location, that's going to inform costs and revenues. And this is going to tell you the viability of your network over time. So, how are you going to sustain that? And then funding eligibility is also pretty straightforward. So like who is served and unserved, this is going to determine what grants you can go for, the scale of those grants, and kind of how to best approach funding a network in a way that makes sense for your specific community. It'll help you balance the needs with funding restrictions and what you want to achieve and what your community wants you to achieve. So again, just a quick list. This is not exhaustive by any means.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirsten. So tons and tons of ways that data is super important through all stages of the broadband planning process. And happy to get into more examples later on in the Q&A if people have specific use cases they want to talk about. But for now, we're going to go through where to find broadband data. And I think there are 4 primary sources, but this is not necessarily exhaustive, where people commonly look to broadband data. I'm going to start with the federal data that's out there. This is also kind of the most complicated to talk about. So you're going to have to bear with me a little bit while we go into the onerous details about federal broadband data. So federal broadband data lives predominantly with the FCC. And the FCC, as many people surely know, is in the process of doing a number of things with federal broadband data. Number one, they are in the process of trying to make their data set the best it can be to show exactly where there are broadband locations that need broadband, and to show what is the current service and service speeds, latency, and providers at those locations all over the country. So this is kind of a novel attempt in that a data set of this granularity has not been created before the FCC started working on it a little over a year ago. And so the map they have is far from perfect, and it will not be perfect, I would argue, for years to come, if ever. The FCC has a fairly complicated process involving a data and mapping vendor called CostQuest, which they've been using for this, as well as soliciting input from ISPs who are supposed to voluntarily share their data on where they provide service. There are also mechanisms for different types of public sector jurisdictions like states, municipalities, counties, and so forth, to submit data on their own about where buildings are, where broadband serviceable locations are, and where if they understand what's served and unserved, they can submit data on that front. And the FCC has also welcomed any individual to go and submit corrections to their map for their own location or locations that they are familiar with. So the map is being updated on a rolling basis. A new version comes out every 6 months. It is still far from perfect. I get into a little bit about more details on those kind of challenge processes in a bit. However, the FCC and the NTIA have decided, since the map is never going to be perfect, we have to use it, start using it in the real world at some point. They have picked June 30th, so in just a few days, to make their state-by-state allocations as part of the BEAD program using the map. The good news is that states are going to find out very soon how much money they're getting from the BEAD program. The good news is that also they're still welcoming challenges to the FCC's broadband map. The bad news is that at this point, those challenges are not going to impact the allocation, but they are still important, and we will, again, talk about why in a little bit. When you get a link to this presentation, the recording and the slides, we've got a link here to a timeline that the FCC put out outlining some of the things that are happening in the next 6 months on the mapping front. So feel free to check that out. Real quick, because submitting challenges is still really important, wanted to just go into the 2 types of challenges that are allowable, what they're for, why they're important. So on the left, we have information about what is called a fabric challenge, fabric location challenge. The fabric is simply the record of where there are buildings that should be receiving broadband service. Again, you can challenge this on an individual basis by going to the FCC's website. If you go to your address and you see it's misrepresented on the map, it's either in the wrong location, or the dot that they have is placed over your barn or your chicken coop rather than your house. Any number of errors like that, you can submit a challenge on your own. But the most useful and high value types of challenges are what you would call bulk challenges submitted by a public sector entity that has a better record of where addresses are than the federal government has. And so you can basically submit a spreadsheet. There's a process to doing that, or a shapefile. And the reason why that is still really important, even though it won't impact the allocations, is that in the BEAD rules, states cannot fund a location for broadband unless it is on the FCC's fabric. So if there's a new development in your community, for example, or if, as was the case for many rural areas and many tribal areas, they just totally whiffed on the first version of where people lived, where their houses were, where the businesses were, it's really important to get those challenges in and try to make the map as good as possible, because that makes it, it's impossible to get funding if your location is not on the map. On the right, we have service availability challenges. And again, to remind everyone, this is the record of who is the provider at the address, or who are the providers, multiple providers, what types of service are they offering from a technological standpoint, and what are the speeds they're offering. Again, individuals can submit challenges, and other jurisdictions can submit bulk challenges. Bulk challenges are trickier with this one, I would say, because you need to have, you need to prove that your data is better, and ISPs get a chance to rebut your challenges if you make those challenges. But some valid reasons for challenging: if you know that an ISP does not offer a technology or speeds of that location and you can prove it, that's a valid challenge. You know, for example, wireless or satellite signal is not available. If you are an individual and you were denied a request for service, or you know, for example, you called a cable provider and said, come hook me up, and they said we can't do it, or they said we can't do it within 10 days, you are allowed to challenge. So there's a number of reasons that are valid. Doing so on an individual level or bulk level can be tricky. Another really important federal broadband map was just released in May, and this is a map of quite a number of previous funding awards. And so the point of this map is because BEAD awards are not supposed to go to double funding other places that have already received funding to build broadband. Well, in order to know that, you need a collection in one place of everywhere that has previously received funding. And so that is what this map intends to do. I would say that it's a great starting point to find out what areas have already received funding, but it is also not comprehensive. It doesn't look super far back in time. It just looks back a couple of years in some instances, and it also doesn't capture every state and local or regional program that has funded broadband. So great place to start, not necessarily the only source of truth for what areas have previously received broadband funding. So Some thoughts on federal data. A lot of the examples Kirsten gave in the beginning of where you need data are for the purposes of planning, right? You need to know what is a viable business plan in your location, for example. The federal data has some licensing restrictions on using the data for planning. The federal data is better for some things than others, and because of licensing restrictions, it is not an allowable for broadband like business planning, for example. There are different cuts of the data that you can use that are that don't have any proprietary information in them, but because the fabric level data, as in the individual building points, has proprietary information from paid data sources, they have said you are not allowed to use that particular data set for broadband planning. There's still, you can use data that's aggregated at the census block through the FCC for planning, just not the actual broadband locations. Another important point here is that states have not yet come up with their grant programs for the BEAD program, and some of them may adhere closer or farther to the FCC data as the source of truth to determine things like grant eligibility and where they will fund and where they won't fund. So it is an open question for every state at this point, whether they are going to consider the federal data a source of truth or not, and how strongly they're going to adhere to what the FCC says is the truth about where there's service and where there isn't. So another point here is that, you know, it is still important to do challenges to the FCC data, as I mentioned. So we'll get into this in a little bit, but it is important to consider whether you have local data, if you're a public sector official, that can be used to challenge, especially the location fabric, but also the service availability. And if you have data that can be credibly used in that type of challenge, it takes a little work. Usually, you know, hopefully you have someone familiar with GIS on your team, but it is well worth it to ensure that federal money can make it all the way to your community, every place in your community that needs it. And then lastly, we'll get into this in a little bit, but if you decide to mount a campaign to collect data, for example, a survey, it is really important to do it in a way that allows you to continue to access that data that you collect. And I'll put a finer point on it. If you want to mount a push in your community to say, everyone, like, help us correct the data, let's make sure we know exactly who's served and who isn't, sending them directly to the FCC's website, although convenient, does put the data directly into the proprietary FCC framework. And so we are recommending that people collect the data on their own. So it is a bulk challenge, but they get to retain that data as well if it is collected at a local level, so that you can use it for planning without any worries about licensing restrictions. And I just want to pause here for a moment and check the chat, but also open it up to the other panelists. Does anyone have any other comments they want to make on federal FCC broadband data? Let me tackle a few of these questions quick, because they're great questions in the chat. Patrick asks, how do you recommend organizations bringing these disparate data sets together to look at them all for an area of interest? For example, FCC and USAC data are notoriously difficult to download and work with. There's a few things on here, Patrick. One, I believe that there are people on GitHub that have written scripts that allow you to more easily download data from the FCC website. So if you have a data person on your team, I would recommend they search for what's essentially open code that people have created to make that easy. But I would also say it's not easy, and that may or may not be intentional, but our organization, for example, had to power through. We wanted to download data for every state from the FCC. we got a bunch of people together, we bought lunch, and everyone worked on their separate computers. They had an assignment of states and files to download. We threw them into the same folder on our local server, and that's how I had to deal with it. Gina says, is there a deadline to submit bulk challenges to FCC? There are, so the answer is yes and no, which is a good question. There is a time where getting your challenges in, you need to get it in before a date in order to likely impact the BEAD program, as I mentioned, and making sure your broadband serviceable locations are in. Ryan, do you have that date off the top of your head? I'm sure we can grab it by the end of this. Oh, sorry, I'm hearing the internet cut out a little bit. Ryan, do you have the date of when we should be getting things into the FCC in order to be relevant for the next round of maps? If you don't have it off the top of your head, we can get it by the end of the webinar, send it out in the information. But it is a rolling challenge. There we go. By September. All right. I think of jinxing it, I'm going to keep moving while my audio recovers. Oh, good. I get to pass it off to Corianne here.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And I'll just start by saying this is a really exciting time for state data because we have a lot of it, and because of the BEAD process, every state is putting together maps right now. And just as a quick background, in case you're new to this space, a lot of the state mapping work started after the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act of 2009, when the federal government put a lot of money into broadband mapping at the state level. But when that funding expired in 2015, 2014, depending on the project, a lot of states didn't have funding to keep that up. So some of them had a period where they didn't have maps. So if you run into any confusion, that might come up where you see a map from 2015 or 2014 that hasn't been updated. But states are now starting to revamp that process. They're getting more money through the funding that's come out through both COVID recovery and also through the BEAD program. So it's a really exciting time for broadband mapping. And just a couple of ways that states have been collecting data. Some of them do use the data from the FCC, but others go a little bit farther by working directly with the providers in their state. And they've built relationships with those providers where the providers voluntarily offer data, and they've been able to incorporate it into their maps. So Colorado and Georgia are both great examples. You can check out their maps. After this, we'll share all the links on the hub, so don't worry about writing all of this down right now. But those are both really great examples. And then some states work with partners. So like Connected Nation is one where you might see the state map on Connected Nation's website. Connected Nation there is the one working directly with the providers, but it's still provider reported data. So Texas and Michigan are a couple of examples of states that work with Connected Nation. And then some states are starting to incorporate speed test data, which is kind of a newer feature of state maps. And Ohio is one example where they've really done county by county profiles of what all the speed test data is showing, so that you can go in and look at your county and see what's represented there. And you can see the graphic off to the side with Ohio. This is not their mapping. This is something we put together, but this kind of shows like a way that you can use the data to tell a different story. Because all of these data sets, I think it's important to note that there are limitations on how you can use them. There are a lot of issues with we need to push to get more granular data. So along with the numbers, we also need to be able to tell the stories and really show visualizations. So working at the community level, you're really well situated to collect those stories. And don't get intimidated by all of the stuff that's coming in around data not being accurate, because if you have those stories to complement it, you can really tell a more robust picture than numbers can tell alone. And then some states also collect adoption data, which is a really important piece of the storytelling part. So Louisiana has put together county profiles with census data. California has also used the census data in their maps, so you can like adjust the layers, add census data, get a better picture of what's going on in your county. And then to Alex's point just now, a lot of states have been encouraging people to challenge the maps. So Oregon is one example where they've really tried to encourage communities to submit their own challenges so that they can ultimately just make all of these maps better. And if you want to look at what your state is doing, you can check out, we have a report we have a one-pager for every single state and territory on our website. It's called Show Me Your Maps, and we're updating that research now. So we should have new data and new one-pagers coming out in the next couple of months. So that's it from me, and I will pass it back to Alex. Thank you.
Awesome, Corianne. All right, we have one slide on municipal data. This is kind of data kept at the local level. This really varies place to place, depending on a lot of considerations about how your municipality or your county operates, what the structures are, what systems they've invested in, and what assets are in place. So, you know, this is a incomplete list of places to go poking around at a local level to see if there's good data. Public Works Department is usually a great source of data. If you have town water sewer, if you have town a municipal electric company, anything like that, they should have a really up-to-date address file of where people are in the community, what buildings are abandoned and not being used, what buildings are being used. This is what Kirsten was referring to when she mentioned power or water meter data, right? Some places know where exactly the lat-long coordinates of every power meter in the community because they have a municipal electric company. Super useful. Sometimes they have pole data and power distribution paths. Oftentimes the Public Works Department will have road center lines, which are a good approximation for power distribution paths. If you don't have that, super useful to understanding if you're going to build a new network, how many miles of fiber do you need to reach everyone? You can use road center lines to approximate that. And some communities even have conduit that they've put in at various points and have a record of. If there isn't good address level data at the Public Works Department, the assessor's office usually has that as well. Parcel data, again, for structures, types of structures, et cetera. And then it's always worth talking to the IT department, public IT department, as well as the IT department at schools, because frankly, they can tell you a lot of things. Sometimes they have records of vertical assets, as in towers, for wireless deployment. And they know things about like general community access to broadband. So your school IT department or your school administrators may be able to, you know what, there are 3 public housing complexes where we routinely have people who can't get connected. They're here, and here. And so that has got to be a critical area in our broadband plan. And so asking around to as many people who will, 911 dispatch, Lynn noted, that's another great one. Those E911 data sets are the data sets that also have some of those extra locations in them, the cemeteries and trailheads that Kirsten was mentioning, but really good data nonetheless. Oftentimes you have to go digging and cobble things together. Sometimes the data is in a filing cabinet and you have to figure out how to digitize it, but usually there's good data at the municipal level. All right, I believe I'm going over to Kirsten with this.
Yeah, okay, so we're gonna be talking about surveys now. Surveys are a super useful method, especially if you don't have pre-existing data to inform a lot of the important parts of the planning process. Surveying allows you to just create one data set specific to your community, and it can go across a wide range of topics, and it's so contextual to your community. So it's a really valuable tool to have in your pocket. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'll just go briefly over, what they can measure: broadband coverage, internet use, and accessibility. They can be used to understand communities' relationship with local providers. How do they feel about their customer service? Are they reliable? Things I already talked about. What are their actual speeds? versus what they're saying their speeds are. And then also, what are people using the internet for? How many devices are there per home? Just really granular data that's going to give you a really good narrative, and also data points that can be helpful in your planning process. Also barriers to adoption, which goes with digital literacy, device ownership, and things like that. Next slide. And then once you get your survey, you'll need to think about just like the best way to distribute it. As a rule of thumb, we suggest 2 out of the 3 of these, but it's not going to be a perfect process. And, but putting a lot of effort in will ensure that your response rates are higher and of good quality. So just to go through these, obviously online surveys are going to be your most efficient and cost effective way to put a survey out there. You can share these with trusted institutions, websites. On the flip side of that, you might have, less people in your community that don't use these platforms or don't use the internet in this way. You will be losing out on some of that data. That's also why we say combine it with something else like physical surveys, which are really good at targeting random samples, but can be a little bit more expensive in terms of like mailing and that kind of stuff, and also data analysis. It doesn't input directly into a software. So there's that. And then phone banks are also a really good option, but because everyone has a phone you can call or a landline, but the cost here is also going to be a little bit higher. Something to note as well is if you don't think you have local capacity to, focus on a survey, or you don't think you're going to get good responses, maybe your community is really disengaged, focus groups can also be super effective. So if you don't have the local capacity to put a survey out there, you can really find a really good narrative with a focus group type thing. So that's all I got.
Great. This is meant to be a transition, and sorry, Stacey, this might be your slide, but I'm already talking, so I'll just try to wrap it up a little bit. But we've got a lot of online resources. We talked about FCC data, which you can access online. States have their data portals. We also wanted to call to your attention a fantastic group called MLabs, and we have someone here who can talk a little bit about that. Catherine, do you want to talk a little bit about what you have available for people?
Sure. Hi, all. Thanks for having me join. So Catherine Conson, I'm the incoming director for Measurement Lab. So for those of you who are not familiar, Measurement Lab has been around for about 14 years and makes publicly available data sources from tests that people run. We call them client tests. So when you run it from your own browser, your own site, and that's when you are trying to figure out, usually we find these tests are run when people are trying to figure out why the internet is not working so well. So if you're not familiar with it, if you go to Google and say, why is my internet slow? The box that pops up, that's sort of the service that's integrated. We get about 4 million tests a day, and 1 million of those come from the United States. Things that are slightly different from MLab, from other data that you may see, we do not collect location data. So for things like Bee Challenge, you would have to include something to incorporate in there. The reason that we don't collect it is we don't want to collect people's PII. So we do have IP addresses that we collect. We get those down to about the census block. We can talk with you all, people who are developing tools to make that a bit narrower. But I think what we have made available is that you can take MLab's tools and integrate them into sort of any process that you have. So some of the guidance that Kristen was just running through about how to do that openly and inclusively so that you're getting as many perspectives as possible is useful. And then you are welcome to keep the data for your own services. I will say that one thing that we are looking into is to try to make a better intake that meets some of the goals outlined in this challenge so that any state can use it. Because what we find and what we've been requested on often is that states who have are exploring this work, or they've already contracted or hired a group to do this for them, still need help on how to use our publicly available data. So we're providing sort of a lot of guidance one by one. And we just think the result of that is that each state will have their own process, and they'll also have their own data. And so it's very hard to get sort of a nationwide map, nationwide in territories of what is the state of broadband in the US. So we are hoping to make this tool even a bit more user-friendly for you all. I'm sure there's questions. I think that that's probably the baseline that you'll need. I don't know if I'm kicking this back to Stacy or who's next.
Yeah, that was awesome. I didn't realize you had so many daily speed tests. That's really, really impressive number. So the only other, besides the obvious, free survey tools out there you can use, I wanted to just call out the National Broadband Resource Hub. Many of the folks on the panel here are representing that online resource, and we would invite you to reach out to us. And we are a philanthropic funded center of gravity to support public sector officials in planning work. And so we've got resources, we've got more webinars, we've got experts that you can talk to directly one-on-one to talk through your particular situation. Just would encourage you to reach out and take advantage of that as you go along your broadband planning way. So, okay, Stacy, back to you.
Thank you, Alex. So now we're going to be moving into the panel discussion portion of the webinar. We have an incredible panel for you today, and I'd like to give a quick introduction before we jump in. Today, we're joined by Kristen Cora, Policy Counsel at Shelby Schools, Health, Libraries, and Broadband Coalition. Brittany Woods-Orson, Broadband Specialist with Alaska Public Interest and Native Movement. And you just heard a little bit from Catherine Townsend, Director at MLab. So we're very grateful to have our panelists here today. And we're gonna get started with some questions. Feel free, panelists, to jump in however you see fit. So our first question today is, are there any other metrics or data points that can be used that affect broadband access or deployment that have not been discussed?
I can start with a little different framework. In Alaska, we are lacking a lot of data on our people due to the remoteness and the small population that is in our state with only under 800,000 people. And so interestingly, through being in the broadband work and needing this data for the grants and learning how to create creative solutions for our disconnected people, it's actually helping us start to collect more data and put a push. And as a Alaska Native person, it's also pushing our tribal communities to be like, what is data sovereignty? Because people have extracted our information. And so I'm on the other end of this, where it's like, I love this work because it is starting to help us solve other problems that we've had prior to not only just internet connectivity.
I'll jump in here and I'll say data points about community anchor institutions. So, we know that the FCC's National Broadband Map, it characterizes many anchor institutions as non-broadband serviceable locations, meaning that there are many schools, libraries, other anchor institutions that are maybe pinpointed on the map, but there's no broadband data available about that location. So I would definitely say that now is the time, as states are preparing their infrastructure plans, especially for BEAD funds, that they engage in their own mapping initiatives to try to map those anchor institutions and to figure out the broadband availability to them. And this is also important for non-traditional anchor institutions as well. So we might think of schools and libraries, healthcare facilities, but we might not think about other types of community centers, places of worship, prisons, other type of institutions that might be included in that definition. So I would definitely say that that's a data point that's still being developed.
And I'll just put in a plug. Thank you for both of those. This is absolutely correct. We always say that there's the best ways to approach this is with more data, because there are so many different ways to look at these questions and to answer them. And also noting the historic and current work of extracting information and having this be a very extractive process, which is always hits historically marginalized, intentionally marginalized communities more. I would just offer, in addition to just the process of trying to get an understanding of where broadband is now, it's once we find those gaps, how are we improving them? And what are the service providers that can step in? Because what I am curious about is that what happens when we do get our best map, then who gets to raise their hand and say, okay, so now give me the contract to fix it. And if we keep going to the exact same organizations, or we don't have different kinds of practices, we'll just have similar cycles of issues. So I don't know that we have a very comprehensive inventory, or that states do, but I think what we've seen is having different options and different challenges are important. I think the stat from California is that 2/3 of people who live in California have no or only one option for broadband. And so it just makes it pretty difficult to improve when you have a monopoly. So, thank you.
Thank you, panelists. And Kristen mentioned community anchor institutions. Our next question kind of feeds into that. For grants that ask for or could benefit from community anchor institution involvement or score higher if you provide service to CAIs, is there data you could use to find and understand coverage at CAIs?
Right. So I would definitely say when it comes to anchor institutions, again, there's not one sort of set data set that gives you information that will provide both from a location standpoint and then also broadband availability. So we really have to take a comprehensive approach when we're trying to find data about anchor institutions, just like with all of our other mapping efforts. So I would say, you can look at the federal level, you can see what federal mapping efforts are out there that might help pinpoint locations of anchor institutions. You could also look at federal databases, so schools and libraries that might participate in the E-rate program or the rural healthcare program. There might be data sets out there that will give you information for those that participate. But then bringing it down to the state level, many states have their own mapping initiatives going on right now where they are mapping anchor institutions. They are trying to figure out broadband availability to those locations. There might be state-led departments, Department of Education or Department of Health, Public Safety that could provide maybe not necessarily broadband availability information, but location information that can then help states to pinpoint where those anchors are located. And then in order to conduct outreach, they can use associations, maybe the American Library Association or other state associations to help conduct outreach specifically to those locations to try to gather that information. And then I would say, last but certainly not least, and maybe most importantly, just really conducting engagement on the local level. So reaching out to those anchor institutions, reaching out to the ISPs and the consumers and the anchor institutions themselves to gather that information. And not only will they have information about what broadband is available, but what the community needs are. So especially if you have libraries who are conducting device lending programs and things like that, they're learning a lot of information about the needs of their communities.
Thank you. I didn't know if Brittany or Catherine want to jump in. We'll move on to the next question. How might you evaluate the accuracy of a particular broadband data set?
I can offer a little bit of an answer. It's challenging. Obviously, we start with the assumption that no broadband data set is fully accurate. Second of all, whenever we use data, we build a little margin of error into what you're using it for, modeling with that data just to account for that. But then I would look at a couple different things. I would look at, what's the source of that data and what's its reputation. Different entities have different, well-documented reputations about what errors or biases might be in their data. And then I would also look at what's the original source of that data, How old is that data? And do you have another data set you can use to compare to it? One of the things that we really appreciate about MLab's data, for example, is, we do work in states that have their own speed test set up that, or have established some type of system for tracking speed. Well, that's all well and good. We can look at the data they provide, but MLabs provides a check on that data. We go and say, okay, is this kind of similar to what MLabs has experienced? And if so, we've got a higher confidence in what the states are providing. And so those are a few initial thoughts.
Yeah, I would just echo Alex. In thinking about this question, I immediately thought of what are the sources that underlie that data? So are we taking into account one particular source? Are there multiple sources that sort of led to this particular data set? And then of course, as Alex mentioned, cross-checking that against other data sets as well.
Thank you, Alex and Kristen. Just in the sake of time, I think we'll do one more question to the panel, and then we'll probably go into our question and answer section. So our last question today is, are there good data sets that you can license or pay for? And if not, what are other strategies used to collect useful data?
I can try to take this. So I, obviously would welcome people using MLab data. We also function as, similarly as Alex said, as a nonprofit. So we do provide the underlying data, but I'll just put in a plug that for anything that is open data and open source, if there are means to supporting those infrastructures, it is very helpful, because otherwise they can go away. And there's a lot of initiatives, businesses, startups that rely on those kinds of infrastructures. So just for those on the call. But there are also groups like Ookla that is also a crowdsource provider that can get more of that PII together and does provide that data. It is something that you have to subscribe to. It is proprietary, so you're not able to then share it out to compare it with sort of other spaces. But we do know that a lot of, there's some states that have found their user interface easier. And so I think that's, worth just acknowledging. We would just combine multiple different data sets. There are also groups that use Cloudflare data. There's some Microsoft data. There is this team that is also somebody that can be contracted with, not trying to endorse any one or another, but have just seen groups that have combined sort of multiple different data sets. And then, of course, the ISPs share a lot of data. The FCC has a ton of data from the ISPs. The ISPs just do not make that data public. And so that would be the most valuable data to be able to have and share. And so we're kind of trying in these kinds of conversations, and these kinds of organizations are providing sort of a third way, independent approach and accountability, because the companies will not make that data public.
And Brittany, if you wouldn't mind being able to maybe follow up with some collecting stories to complement the data.
Yeah, I'm part of Alaska State Digital Equity Planning Team, the Making the Plan. And I would also want to add too, like, if you're going to go to people and ask them for their story and essentially, be a part of this extractive process, you have to bring like what resources you do have and information, because in Alaska, so many times university projects, government projects have come into these communities, promised these things, and then they never hear from them or understand why we're doing it. And so, I'm really grateful for this process we had in Alaska, where they brought everyone who was working on the internet together. And, there's not that many of us with capacity. And I brought this up and we're like, okay, let's bring out ACP materials, Affordable Connectivity Program. And we have, human trafficking is an issue here. And so we brought materials, how to be safe online. And we had one planning summit where all of us could like bring someone and we told stories, and it really hit to home like the impossible standards people are working against. And like one that pops up to this in my mind is there was a veteran who wanted to start a nonprofit, and he had to fill out the online survey 17 times because you had to do it in one sitting. And then he had to drive 3 hours north to go to the biggest city to like go to a coffee shop. And so we're working against these really difficult standards, but in this process, we're deepening our relationships. And, you know, this is going to end in September. It's like, how do we start a coalition? And it's transitioning. And so despite like not having so much to start with, it's making more creative solutions and a deeper community that will stick together in the long run.
Thank you, Brittany. I see that we had some Q&A questions that have been answered already, but I wanted to leave some time for the audience. If you had any other questions that you were saving for this time, please feel free to add them in the chat.
While people do that, I'm happy to offer one more little cut at data collection that we haven't talked about before. Another thing that we've certainly done as on behalf of some of our clients that I know is a common practice at a certain point in the broadband process is to go out and frankly drive the streets and collect data yourself if you need as accurate of data as possible. And that's often required as you get very close to actually starting to deploy infrastructure. And so we have gone and documented using a tablet with some GIS tools, like where does Comcast infrastructure start and stop exactly in a community? Or you can even document things even more granularly than driving around in a car. But if you are, for example, paying an entity to extend their infrastructure from where it stops to the end of the road, it's a good idea to go do that type of data collection manually, because you don't want to pay for any foot longer than you need to. So just another source for when you need really, really accurate data.
That's helpful. Thank you, Alex. Doesn't look any more questions coming in, and I know we're kind of wrapping up the end of our hour. I wanted to thank everyone for attending today, especially our 3 panelists. We appreciate your insights and your time. I believe that everyone in attendance will be receiving a link to the slides, which also contain different links to external sites for more information. So please look out for those, and also a recording of today's webinar. Okay, well, thank you all so much. I didn't know if anyone from the Corey or NCC team had anything else they wanted to add.
No, thank you, Stacy. We're always here to help. Please do reach out to us after we send out the recording. You can email us. You can go to the Hub website and find us there as well. So thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.